Is it time for the sedition law to be scrapped? Can our country actually afford it? Or does it need to come back but in a different form? This is the question I'm asking this week on One Take. Hello and welcome. I'm Pallavi Ghosh. Ironically, the sedition law was introduced in a country by the Britishers, and today Britain itself doesn't have this law. Now, why did the British introduce it? That is because they did not want any kind of a person to raise their head against the British Raj. You know, when it was becoming clear that a momentum was being built up against them and a freedom movement was emerging to oust them from our country, voices were rising against the Britishers. The British devised this law to ensure that no one raises their head. The sedition law was used by the British to arbitrarily pick up people, arrest them. There was a kind of a political harassment which was taking place, torture, and very often those people would never ever come out alive. And then the question now arises in recent times that we are an independent country. We are a democracy. We have a right to freedom of expression. We have a robust system. And why do we need a sedition law? And isn't it then possibly open to misuse? Well, this debate has been going on for time immemorial as far as the country is concerned, but recently it's come back into a narrative because the Supreme Court of India has put a hold on it. It's given rise to a lot of controversy once again. There's one group who feels that this is a win-win situation. India does not require a sedition law because we already have the UAP, or the Prevention of Atrocities Act, and the Prevention of Unlawful Activities Act, and therefore, why do we need a separate sedition law? Anyone who makes a statement or works against the democratic principles of our country and of our constitution can easily be picked up and face action. You don't require a law which has been framed by the Britishers to suit their purpose. Also, no political party which is in power wants too much of resistance against them, and therefore every political party is actually guilty, is often accused of misusing the sedition law. As they say in Hindi, and a famous kahawat is "Hammam mein sab nange hain." Those who are pointing a finger at the central government tend to forget that how they have also used it at their own level. So whether it's been a Congress party in power at the state level or at the central level, they are equally accused of misusing this law and resisting dissent. In fact, if you remember, every time the Congress accuses the BJP of crushing the voice of democracy is the emergency days which are shown back to the Congress party as a mirror. Well, enough of that. But now we come back to whether the question is that can we really afford a complete doing away with the sedition law? If you look at the Unlawful Practices Act which is there, many of those provisions are similar to what is already imbibed in sedition law, but sedition is much more grave, much more serious, and you know, if you are convicted under that, then the kind of action you face is much, much harsher. Since 2014, at least 399 to 400 cases of sedition law have been made out, and of them roughly 10 to 12 only have been convicted. And therefore, those who argue in favor for complete doing away with the sedition law say that, look, the rate of conviction is so low, which means the credibility of this law is so low, and therefore, why do you even need something like a Sedition Act to be used against the people? Second, recent cases on where the Act of Sedition law has been used have often been arguable on very flimsy grounds. You know, you've tweeted something, you put something on Facebook, you've said something on WhatsApp, you've released a video. Now, if that is seen as an act of sedition against the country, you can be picked up. For example, the case of the Ranas in Maharashtra. They were picked up for planning to recite the Hanuman Chalisa outside the Chief Minister's residence, and they were actually charged under the sedition law. And that's where all debate began. You can accuse them of violating security, why they were using the Hanuman Chalisa as a political tool. Those acts could be applied to them, but to charge them with sedition, which means it's an act of treason against the country, for many it was something which was preposterous. It was seen as a misuse of this law by the political powers in Maharashtra against the MLA and the MP, Navneet Rana. And therefore, this argument began that how, if you have this law, it is always going to be open to misuse, and therefore you really need to do away with. It really came as a coincidence or a right timing, one would say, when the Supreme Court put a hold on it. But interestingly, the reaction which came in from the Law Minister, Kiren Rijiju, actually reflects the thinking within the central leadership. And I would say many who don't speak against it openly or speak for it openly, actually their thoughts are reflected in what Kiren Rijiju said. And what he said essentially, and when I spoke to him, he said that there is a Lakshman Rekha. There is a yardstick which has to be followed. You cannot cross the bridge. And therefore, while we welcome what the Supreme Court has said, we cannot expect that people can be getting away easily because you cannot cross the Lakshman Rekha. What he essentially tried to say is that there is some merit in keeping the sedition law going. Now, what sources are telling us from the government, and what our hunch certainly is, which we also picked up from sources very close to a law ministry and from the government, is that this has been put on hold till the government comes out with some kind of a mechanism or provides an alternative. The government certainly is not in a mood to do away with the sedition law because it fears and it anticipates that it can actually be misused to carry on acts of treason against our country. We know how vulnerable our border areas are concerned. Northeast, China breathing down the back. Then there's Pakistan breathing down Kashmir, always trying to create problem. Bit of Punjab border areas as well. And therefore the act of sedition is something which is a reality, and government sources say it can actually be misused and would bolster those who carry on this treason against a country and side with the terrorists. And therefore a complete do-away with the sedition law is something which is not going to help the case. So what we are picking up by way of our government sources is this, that they are mulling a kind of an alternative. Something not as harsh, but something which will ensure that anyone who tries to use the constitution or democracy and violate it because they want to embolden the terrorists or those who are working against the country would have to face the music. The government will also try and ensure that it cannot be misused by the political masters. It cannot be used to be slapped on frivolous cases, like in the case many argue was in the case of the Ranas as well. Just because you are tweeting something or you're writing on a social media timeline or you're sending a WhatsApp forward doesn't mean you can necessarily be charged under the sedition law. Yes, there's this argument that you already have the UAPA in place and therefore why do you need a sedition law separately? Well, my sources also tell me that the government doesn't believe this argument holds because there are certain activities which don't come under the UAPA for which you need a separate law. India is at a vulnerable juncture. Because India is progressive, we are coming down very harshly on acts of terror. There are always those elements who are going to try and stoke trouble. And sometimes, unfortunately, there are people lying within our country who are actually emboldening those forces. And therefore, this will act as a deterrent. A complete do-away of the sedition law is not going to be acting as a deterrent. And that's the reason why there's a strong argument which is being made in favor of it. But you give us your reactions, because when I see people responding on the social media timeline, I do see extreme points of view. Some say that seeing the critical situation we are in, it is very important that the law needs to be amended but not completely done away with. There's some who say and who cite instances that there are people, for example, students from JNU, they are young political or social activists who are still languishing in jails because the Sedition Act has been applied against them. And therefore the argument is that since British, who actually brought this law into a country, they themselves have done away with, and it's not that they don't have a law in place which deals with acts of sedition, therefore why does India even need a sedition law? And therefore I'm asking you, my viewers, for your response. What do you think? Do you think the sedition law needs to be brought back in a different form, or it's high time that we do away with it? Do give us your reactions on the social media timeline. Thank you so much for watching.